This is woodblock printmaker David Ball, back with the next episode in our Great Wave project. In the previous couple of videos, I've chatted quite a bit about some of the research points that surround this work. And since I've made those, I've learned a great deal more about this design and a lot of interesting things about some of the copies held in major museums. But I think that what this video series needs at this point is an episode focused on the actual process of making the thing. So I'm going to put aside the research points today and talk about how I'm actually doing this work. Once the carving starts, that job will take quite a while, so perhaps we can come back to the research issues while I'm doing that job. So let's get down to it. As you can see, with the tablet still here on my desk, I'm still tracing. It's coming along very well, and it won't be long now before the hanshita, that's the thin sheet of very fine paper that contains the image, will be ready to paste down on the block and get ready for carving. Over the years, I've gradually figured out a pretty good way of doing this tracing work. I used to do it in a completely analog way. For each print that I planned to make, I first prepared an enlargement of the print, either by ordering a large-scale photograph or by patching together color photocopy enlargements of a print piece by piece. I put those on my light table, which was actually just a hole cut in my carving bench and covered with acrylic. And then I traced the key lines onto a sheet of that same very thin Japanese paper. I worked at least 200% scale, and sometimes as much as 400%, so I ended up with quite a large sheet sometimes. One of the jobs I did was this print, a reproduction of a fairly rare and unusual Haranobu design. This is the print that I ended up with, and this is the tracing that I made to create it. Working at this scale made it possible for me to catch most of the taste in the line work. Now, to get this thing scaled back down, to get this thing scaled back down to the actual size for printing, I took it to an industrial print shop, a place that dealt with blueprints and architectural drawings, stuff like that. And they had a large machine with a huge bed that would take this. I provided them with a special two-part paper that I needed for the hanshita. We'll be talking about that in a future episode, and they scaled it down to the dimensions I needed for the carving to begin. The days of working over a light table are gone, and I now do everything on my Mac using Photoshop and a pressure-sensitive pen tablet. I still need a master image, of course, and that's something I've either scanned in or obtained from some other source. To get an accurate representation of the lines and the detail in a typical print, I need something around 300 dots per inch at a minimum. For this Great Wave project, I don't actually have that much, but I'm getting by. Here's the procedure. With the main image in a Photoshop file, I create a new layer immediately above it, flood this with white, and then turn it off for now. I then make another layer above that, which is where my tracing will appear. I set this layer to 50% opacity and select a basic bright red as the working color. I use a pretty standard brush with the shape dynamics and smoothing turned on. The brush opacity is full, but the hardness, this is important, is about 50%. I then set the image view size at 200% for this job anyway, and then begin tracing with the pen. Because the tracing layer is set to 50% opacity, I can always see the master beneath it. Without that, I can't tell if I've gone too far over the lines, because my red trace would cover everything. I don't attempt to replicate the shape of the original brush strokes in a single pass with my pen. It's a different tool and just won't give the same effect. I paint my way up to the original lines bit by bit. Now and then, I click on that white layer I mentioned, and this gives me a very stark and clear view of what I have drawn. And I always need to go back over and add a bit of red here or slice a bit away with the eraser brush. I sometimes click those two layers, the red and the white, off and on together to give me a chance to compare my work with the original. I do as much with the eraser as I do with the brush, coming up to the edge of each line from the inside and coming down with the eraser from the outside. Now, right about now, I can hear what a number of you are thinking. Somebody teach this guy how to properly use Photoshop. You don't need to trace everything like this. Photoshop can extract those lines for you. Well, actually, it's not quite that simple. There are a number of reasons why trying to do this job automatically isn't practical. And let's investigate a couple of them. Before I can do that, I have to step back a minute and show you something about our printing work. Earlier this afternoon, I took this camera into our printing room at the back of the shop here. Here's young Ayumi Miyashita. She's been working with us as a printer for near on 3 years now. Today she's making a new batch of prints for Jed Henry, some more of the I Choose You design. On her next break, I'm going to ask her to print something for me to show you about what we call tamari. I asked her to prepare a couple of blank sheets of paper and then to print them from the same block. But I also asked her to do something else. I asked her to print them a bit carelessly and quickly, and not to worry about tamari. She thought I was nuts, but after I explained that it was all in a good cause, she complied. Let's look at her results. Please remember that I asked her to do this badly. Don't assume that her normal work looks like this. Looking closely at one particular part of the line work, you might notice that here and there you can see small black blobs and irregularities in the lines. These are what we call tamari. And this is the paste pigment mix applied just a tad too heavily and then brushed off, or not brushed off, a bit carelessly. Look how much the lines of the design have changed and thickened. Now if we asked a Photoshop filter to examine that image and extract the line work for us, it would of course not have a clue as to what the original shape of the line should be, and the image presented to the carver would be a distorted image of the original block. Here's an even more grotesque example from a book I have here. Why on earth would they use this awful copy for their illustration? Look at that tamari. As to how I myself deal with this, let's look at an area of the Great Wave that I'm tracing. This area here, clearly these dots are junk. They shouldn't be there. This blob on the bottom of this line, perhaps that's pretty clearly tamari, shouldn't be here. But what about the slight darkness around the edge of that tip? Is that tamari? What about along the back of this one? How far down should I thin these? How much of this should I leave? How much of it should I cut off? Here's what I'm trying. That's clearly gone, that's clearly gone. At the top of this I've shaved a bit more off because it seems to me that's tamari at the top. But I have no way of really telling. My finished print may be, let's try and look at this. So that's cleaner view. My finished print may have cleaner lines, or I may have taken away some of the roughness that's part of Hokusai's vitality. I have no way to really tell. But there's more. It gets even more difficult. Woodblock prints in the Japanese traditional system were all made with basically transparent pigments. That's how we get overlaid colors. A blue printed on top of a yellow gives a green tone in the finished print. Publishers and designers keep this in mind at every stage of the production process. It's not like an oil painting where an artist will layer things on and layer things on, even putting lighter tones on top of darker tones. We can only get darker, never lighter. And the important point to make here is that because the pigments are transparent, every single impression of every block made on this print will be visible at the end of the process. Let's look at another extreme close-up of one part of our print. Okay, we're looking at a place in the middle of the wave where all three blues are visible. There's the faintest pale blue, there's the intermediate blue, and there's the deepest darkest blue, which is the curly key lines plus this deep area. Now the intermediate blue runs underneath the dark blue as well. Let me scroll up a bit here. We can see something that interesting happens here. If we follow this key block line down, look in the middle of it. There seems to be a line in the middle of it. And that line is where the intermediate blue, the block to print the intermediate blue, has been cut at the end. Partway in the middle of that line. It's normally hidden. You wouldn't even notice this with your naked eye. Here it comes. There's a line down there along the edge. And look here, it actually sticks out a bit. This shouldn't have happened. That should have been trimmed off. Now for me, in some places like this where it's clearly visible, when I'm tracing the darkest one, I just trace around the outside there and the inside here, and there's no problem. But in other places, it's nowhere near as clearly visible. Look here. Do I end my key block line here? Does it come up this far? Does it come to that point? The combination and the blues layering on top of each other make it very, very difficult for me to figure out exactly what's key block and what's an intermediate block. Let me pop up what I've done so far. I've done it in black here. This is what I've traced so far as the key lines. So in this area near my pencil, I've considered that that comes up to a point. I think that's probably where it comes. Inside here, is this tamari or is that actual key line? Who knows? I've drawn it like this, but it's almost impossible to tell what it actually is. So as for extracting all these key lines automatically in Photoshop, I just don't see how it is possible. The only way for me to get a good clean image of the key lines ready for carving is to go over every square millimeter of this thing, tracing as I go, and trying to decide just where each line should fall. That's the way it used to be done, of course, pre-war or earlier. Not with Photoshop, of course, but by working with an extremely thin paper placed over an original copy. I don't have that kind of a skill with a brush, and in any case, using this kind of massive enlargement here in the computer does give far more accurate results. Okay, as I said at the beginning of the video, I'm really almost finished with this, and the tracing is coming along very, very well. I've just got the characters and the boats left. The mountain is done. All the waves are done, and I think I've managed to capture most of Hokusai's taste. We'll see when we get down to the actual printing stage. So that's enough for today. See you next time, but as usual, before we close it off, let's head outside. It's cold out there today, something a bit different. Yes, it's the first snow day of the year here on Dokudori. That's our shop in the background there. And if I turn around and walk about 15 seconds towards the direction of the famous Dempo Inn, the famous Dempo Temple, there's one of the gates was open this morning, and we can see inside to where the very famous garden is. These people are sweeping in front of one of the small shrines there. Over on the left-hand side, though, there's the famous Chingodo Hall. This is an Otanuki-sama, a shrine dedicated to the tanuki, the raccoon dogs that live here. There's a little wash basin with a nice little dragon. I should have got a bit closer, I guess, with the camera. And then turning around and looking past the first shrine, we saw the famous little pond. Unfortunately, there's no public access to this, and this is as close as we're going to be able to get. But what a nice day for our visit.